Hi, everyone. So, you are reading A Dollhouse and you are watching my lectures on A Dollhouse and specifically Zola's idea of realism or naturalism in the theater as one of the strategies that was created in order to more effectively examine the representation of reality, right? If we are to look at or if we are to represent those which have not been um, historically represented because of who was in the position of power or privilege or capacity to create art that was a representation of reality, then we would need to somehow diversify or come up with a strategy that somehow indeed got closer to the representation of marginal communities, right? Those in which have not had the privilege. And so realism naturalism was one of the ways to do that. Zola believed in going for the hyper real, right? To really just get in there and have the theatrical language be that which um, was authentic to the experiences of people who were in lower class situations, who were women, um, who were potentially people of color, who were somehow in the margins of Western society, right? So it was like get get exact, almost like the performative parallel to photorealism. Yeah, Brecht had a different idea, and it was, again, attempting to represent reality. So, with the same intent as naturalism and realism. But instead, Brecht came up with a theory that basically argued that you cannot actually represent reality. Let me take that back. You can't make reality on the stage because the stage is not reality. So he critiqued this idea that the to be as accurate on the stage as possible to where it didn't seem like it was any different than reality, the way Zola was trying to champion, was foolish. And instead of trying to actuate reality on the stage, which Brecht thought was impossible, to focus more on the idea that you're representing the ideas of reality, that you're representing the critical dimensions of reality. So Brecht said, stop trying to be real and instead focus on the audience and trying to inspire them to think critically about what they're seeing. And so Brecht came up with a form of theater that he called epic. And epic theater proposed that a play should not cause the spectator to identify emotionally with the characters or the plot, but instead should incite more of a self reflection, a critical perspective of what's happening on the stage. So, indeed, he believed that you needed to create theater that consciously made the audience not kind of dive in or get swept away by the emotionality. He thought the experience of the catharsis of emotion that Aristotle had established in the Poetics, way back in theater, left an audience complacent, as if they didn't really develop anything as a result. He just thought that it assuaged them of their concerns, that it acted um, more as like eating candy rather than nourishment of any kind. He wanted his audiences to adopt a critical perspective in order to recognize social injustice and exploitation, and to be moved to go forth from the theater and actually affect change outside in the world. And so he thought that the way to do that was to highlight the artifice of the theatrical experience, right? That it wasn't real. And that way, the audience would form a critical distance. Yeah. And also to communicate the idea that all of our realities are constructed. And as such, they are changeable. Yeah. So, not to be completely swept into the story and the character's emotionality, but indeed to have a critical distance, understand that all reality is constructed, much like what was happening on the stage, and that way we would come to understand that our reality was constructed. So, obviously, this is inspired by social constructivism of the modernist age. Yeah. And even though it didn't feel real, that indeed we were actually getting more into what reality is as a result. So you can see this is definitely a response and or a critique to Zola's idea of how to manifest reality on the stage. Yeah. But in both cases, they intended to highlight those that have not typically been represented or identified in art and specifically the theatrical tradition. Okay. And Brecht's most kind of dynamic theatrical technique, he called the Verfremdungseffekt. um, some people have translated that as alienation effect, but I think more appropriately would be better to call it defamiliarization. And this was the way to have the audience understand that what was happening on the stage was not meant to sweep them away, that indeed it was supposed to be um, an experience where there was a critical distancing so that the audience could reflect on their own experiences rather than be caught up in the characters' experiences on the stage. And very, very simply described, this Verfremdungseffekt or defamiliarization effect was a series of techniques that just made it very clear that what was happening on stage was not real. So it took out anything that would give the illusion of reality. So there were not realistic sets. There were not realistic ways of performing. Or at least, if there were moments of realism, that it would then be disrupted by something that was not realistic. Yeah. So some of the some of the examples would be like the stage lighting would all of a sudden get really harsh and bright, like false, right? Not look natural, right? Or there would be a song interjected, even though it was not a musical. Um, that was very common, especially in the Three Penny Opera, which many of you might know about, Brecht's most famous work. Um, there would be moments where the actors, instead of reciting their lines, would then move to like using posters or placards with their lines on it and be kind of, um, shuffling them, right? You know how you see that quite a bit lately in TikToks? That started in Brecht, funny enough. Um, then to even, a character at one moment to be speaking as if they are in the first person as a character to then talk about themselves in the third person, right? There would be moments where they would speak the stage directions out loud so that you knew that they were following a script and you wouldn't get caught up thinking of them as real characters. So these are all elements that were affiliated with the Verfremdungseffekt. And again, the idea was to kind of consciously have the audience distance themselves from any notion that what they were watching was real. And by doing so, it incited more of a critical consideration of what was happening on the stage. And then, of course, Brecht would bring in characters who were deemed marginal. Now, Brecht mostly dealt with class issues. He was from Nazi Germany, and just the idea of like Marxist sensibility and certainly the Weimar Republic of the early 20th century inspired him to be thinking more on issues of class. So he was very interested in representing the poor, which so was Zola, right? But we have since used epic theater and the Verfremdungseffekt for issues that related to marginal cultures, to women, to queers, all those seen kind of outside of the privileged standard in the West. And so we have many, many examples of, of theatrical practices since the time of Brecht that utilize this technique. I've provided a description and then a couple videos to supplement what I'm saying here. The important aspect is to know that many different theater practitioners were engaging in trying to figure out a way to represent the diverse reality of Western culture. And Zola's theory and Brecht's theory are two of the more prominent ones. And we want to have them in our minds because perhaps we will consider them in our own ideation of staging for race, gender, and sexuality. I hope that makes sense. This is supplement, of course. Maybe think for yourself. Do you appeal more to Zola's technique of a hyperrealism or to this kind of conscious fracturing of what representation is or what reality is, according to Brecht?